Hey, good afternoon to you. 306 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up, 3:30, we're going to talk to Brian Cavanaugh, visiting fellow from the Heritage Foundation, former FEMA official, about all these hurricanes and the aftermath and the federal response. Brian's got a lot of perspective on this. Coming up at 4:30, Philip Wegman from Real Clear Politics is here. He had a couple of very important questions for Corinne and Joe Biden yesterday. We'll discuss. And then Beth Serio joins us from Do No Harm at 5 o'clock. Her group looking to protect children across the country, finding out just how many child mutilations have been taking place over the last few years. A new shocking report on that subject. Beth will join us at 5, and you can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Milton came and went. My goodness. All the concern about Hurricane Milton certainly led to millions of people fleeing the area. The update, as we understand it right now, the Associated Press with some of the most recent data, finding that at least 5 are dead after Milton had knocked out power to over 3 million Floridians, and it spawned all of these nasty tornadoes. The tornadoes apparently were where it seems the deaths came from. And again, lots of power knocked out. When I saw the headlines this morning that it was Tropicana Field down in St. Petersburg that had lost portions of its roof, and that was the biggest headline we saw coming out of the storm, I wiped my brow with relief. I was like, oh, good. They're talking about a sports stadium losing a portion of its roof. If that's the biggest headline from this thing, that's much better news than so many were expecting. Now, I say that there are communities all up and down the coast in Florida who are now picking up the pieces today after having a storm savage their homes and wash up debris and knock down trees and power lines. There's a real and what will be long recovery effort as a result of all of this. But as Governor Ron DeSantis has been saying, this was not the worst case scenario, and for that, we're all very grateful. And I think a lot of prayers, certainly in my family, were answered by all of this. I mentioned to you yesterday that my parents live in that area of Florida, that is in Southwest Florida. And the good news is, as we understand it from this distance, they were with me, so that's great. I was happy to have them. That brought us a lot of comfort. But their home is fine. The water didn't get in, didn't rise to the level of getting into the house. And so that's, once again, prayers answered. But I think continued prayers are going to be important. President Trump has been raising money for the victims of the hurricane. This is the number at the top of this hour, Corey, the number that you have in here? Okay, good. This is $7.7 million so far raised for the victims of Hurricane Milton. How much has Kamala Harris raised? What was the number on that one? Oh, it's zero. Sorry. I was just making sure. We had to do a quick fact check. $0 raised by Kamala Harris. So that's the money competition right now. Although, did you see earlier this week that somehow in like the 4 weeks Kamala Harris has been running for president, she's already raised over $1 billion? How did that happen? How did Kamala Harris, a woman with no personality, no charisma, no policies, no accomplishments, no record of anything useful, how did she raise $1 billion in 8 days or whatever the time frame? Are you wondering if the game is rigged? Are you wondering if the big corrupt moneyed interests in our country maybe have a preferred candidate? $1 billion? $1 billion. You remember it was the Obama campaign, the first time we reached $1 billion in an entire campaign. Oh, my goodness, $1 billion. It was unheard of that a presidential campaign did that. She just did that in however many months she's been. I think it's like 3 months now. That's it? Wow. Amazing. Just amazing. So President Trump has raised $7.7 million as of the top of this hour. He housed a bunch of linemen, that is the people who handle putting power poles back up and getting people connected back to electricity. He housed over nearly 300 of them, actually, nearly 300 at his Trump Doral resort. Last night, they got luxury accommodations. They got to sleep in some nice warm beds in preparation for getting out there on the road to reconnect people to power. And what has the Biden White House been doing? What have they been occupying their time with? Attacking Trump. How many press briefings did we get? Televised moments yesterday where they just spent the whole time just attacking Trump. There's a hurricane coming, but you know what really is awful? Trump. That's what Biden did that on several occasions yesterday, several televised occasions, scripted occasions. And then today he was asked about, have you spoken to Trump? And here's how that went.
Have you spoken with former President Trump at all?
Are you kidding me? Mr. President Trump, former President Trump, get a life, man. Help these people.
Will you hold him accountable? You said
President Trump has raised $7.7 million as of 3 o'clock today and housed hundreds of linemen in an effort to reconnect the power in Florida.
you were going to hold those accountable.
Public will hold them accountable. You better than the press hold them accountable because you know the truth.
Do you plan to speak with former President Trump?
No.
Do you plan to speak to former President Trump? No. He grumbles. And you heard what he said there. The press was saying, would you please hold him accountable? The members of the media are demanding that Joe Biden met out some sort of punishment to Trump for what exactly? For criticizing the federal government? You're not allowed to do that. Are you going to hold him accountable, Mr. President? And the president, instead, Biden turns to the press and says, you're going to hold him accountable. So Biden gives the press their marching orders. They need to attack Trump. I'm too busy to attack Trump. I can't do that. You need to attack Trump. That's your job, says Biden. So the press and Joe Biden having a very normal day where they discuss whose turn it is to attack his political opponent in the wake of a storm where, yes, we have 5 dead, untold amounts of damage. That's how Biden's acting. Biden also has no idea what he's talking about. Now, to set this next clip up, I just want to tell you the population of the entire state of Florida is 23 million people. So listen to Joe Biden as he says how many electrical workers have now arrived.
3 million people are without power, but more than 40 million power line workers have come from around the country, from Canada to Florida, to restore power across the state.
There you go. 40 million, did he say power line workers? Is that what he said? 40 million power line workers have arrived in the state. Now who's spreading misinformation, Joe? Who's doing that? Who built the misinformation, Joe? Who did that? I think that was you, brother. I think that was you. There's a lot going on here. Ron DeSantis has been exactly who you'd expect him to be. He's been a star during all of this. He's given constant updates on every aspect of this. And Kamala Harris tried to stick her stupid face into the entire process because she figured that she could get some political points here if she was like, well, look at me. I'm in charge. I'm the lady. I'm running the whole show. Now, Joe Biden kept stepping on all of her various statements and events this week. But there was this whole saga between Kamala Harris and Ron DeSantis, to the extent that it exists, is really a one-sided, stupid thing. But it started earlier this week when Kamala's team was making the claim that, Ron DeSantis didn't take her phone calls, and she's entitled to the phone calls. This is the woman who, when she was the Attorney General of California, demanded that her staff stand in the morning and say, good morning, General, when she walked into the building. This is the same person. So she thinks she's entitled to a governor who's about to experience an awful storm in his state and is trying to figure out how to take care of his people. She's entitled to phone calls with him. DeSantis better answer my calls, she's thinking to herself. Can you imagine if the rest of us acted like this? Ron DeSantis better take my call. Corey, call Ron DeSantis right now. He better take my call. Preposterous. Here's Kamala Harris complaining that the random aide that her team spoke with didn't pass her along to Ron DeSantis.
Governor DeSantis, NBC is reporting Governor DeSantis is ignoring your calls on hurricanes, resources, and help. How does that hurt the situation here?
Loaded.
Moments of crisis, if nothing else, should really be the moment that anyone who calls themselves a leader says they're going to put politics aside and put the people first. People are in desperate need of support right now, and playing political games with this moment in these crisis situations, these are the height of emergency situations, is just utterly irresponsible, and it is selfish.
It is utterly irresponsible not to take my useless phone call, not to take, her call is about as useful as one of those like car warranty scams or somebody hassling, you want to sell your house? You want to sell your house? Like, how about no? How about I'm sorry I answered the phone? Why am I even talking to you? Over on CNN, Scott Jennings, the voice of reason on that network, is pointing out that this is so moronic for her campaign.
I think you, in all of your public communications, no matter what you're doing, you have to always show the American people that you have their fellow citizens in your heart. I mean, this is the kind of historic storm that, some people aren't going to survive it. There's going to be widespread property devastation. And you have to just show the empathy that people would expect out of the American president. So that's, I think, campaign communications, number one. Number two, what you can't do is try to insert politics into this. And I think, honestly, this week when Kamala Harris attacked Ron DeSantis as he was preparing for this hurricane, that was a huge campaign mistake for her. She should not have done that. Biden came out and corrected the record, said he and DeSantis are working well together. That was the proper response.
Yeah, Biden's like, who cares? I'm working fine with her. She's not even the president. Biden getting annoyed that everybody's acting like Kamala's in charge. Screw her. I'm in charge. I'm having a great time with DeSantis. He doesn't even care about her campaign talking points. And here's Ron DeSantis this morning on CNBC, putting the cherry on top of this.
I am working with the President of the United States. I'm working with the Director of FEMA. I'm marshaling all my state assets. We've been doing this now nonstop for over 2 weeks between Helene and this. And so if there's anything I can leverage to benefit my people, I'm going to do it. The fact of the matter is they put out a story saying I didn't even know she was trying to reach me, but she has no role in this process. And I've been dealing with these storms in Florida under both Trump and Biden. Neither of them ever politicized it. And in fact, all the storms I've dealt with under this administration, although I've worked well with the president, she has never called in Florida. She has never offered any support. So what she's doing is she's trying to inject herself into this because of her political campaign. So as the governor here who's leading this, I don't have time for those games. I don't care about her campaign. Obviously, I'm not a supporter of hers, but she has no role in this process. And so I'm working with the people I need to be working with. We're leveraging the resources I need to be leveraging. And for her to try to say that my focus should be on catering to her rather than worrying about my own people just shows she doesn't understand what it means to respond to these natural disasters.
Kamala's such an idiot. Why would you pick a fight with Ron DeSantis? Kamala is one of the single least impressive politicians in the entire country. Ron DeSantis is one of the most impressive. This guy can run 10,000 circles around her before she even knows what happened. And he just did it again. So she's just ridiculous. Now, DeSantis, for his part, he'll take all comers. Like, hey, anybody else want to fight? Anybody? Is there anybody else out there who wants to pick a fight in the middle of all of this, trying to advance your stupid political agenda? Well, today, while he's talking about the aftermath of the storm, this morning he's talking about it, just as the people are waking up, they're looking around, trying to figure out whether or not their lives are still together, what's going to happen with their homes and their goods. A reporter says, hey, don't you think we have a problem with global warming? DeSantis handles them. I'll share that with you in just a moment.
Mr. President, does Governor DeSantis need to take Vice President Harris's calls?
All I can tell you is I'm talking to Governor DeSantis. He's been very gracious. He's thanked me for all we've done. He knows what we're doing, and I think that's important.
No help from Joe Biden for Kamala Harris. Philip Wegman asking that question. Does Governor DeSantis need to take the vice president's calls? And he's like, DeSantis is doing great. I've been talking to him. Philip Wegman joins us at 4:30 to discuss. Back to Ron DeSantis's press briefings today. DeSantis was out. He's out as we speak, speaking to people about what's happening in Florida and the recovery effort there. And by the way, the breaking news on that subject is they say so far across the state there have already been 340 rescues done. So there's very much a lot of chaos, despite despite this not being the absolute worst case scenario, as DeSantis told us today, there are a lot of rescues going on. People need help for sure. DeSantis was asked by a reporter today whether or not all of this was caused by global warming and what he has to say about that. Listen to this.
It's not due to global warming.
Tornadoes?
Yeah, the increase in tornadoes.
I think you could go back and find tornadoes for all of human history for sure, and especially Florida. How does this storm rate in kind of the history of storms? I think it hit with a barometric pressure of what was it, about 950 millibars when it hit, which I think if you go back to 1851. There's probably been 27 hurricanes that have had so the lower the barometric pressure, the stronger it is. I think there have been about 27 hurricanes that have had lower barometric pressure on landfall than Milton did. And of those, 17 occurred, I think, prior to 1960. And the most powerful hurricane on record since the 1850s in the state of Florida occurred in the 1930s, the Labor Day hurricane. Barometric pressure on that was 892 millibars. It totally wiped out the Keys. We've never seen anything like it, and that remains head and shoulders above any powerful hurricane that we've ever had in the state of Florida. The most deadly hurricane we've ever had was in 1928, the Okeechobee hurricane, killed over 4,000 people. Fortunately, we aren't going to have anything close to that on this hurricane, but even ones like Ian, where you had, wasn't even close to that. So, I just think people should put this in perspective. They try to take different things that happen with tropical weather and act like it's something. There's nothing new under the sun. This is something that the state has dealt with for its entire history, and it's something that we'll continue to deal with.
The guy's literally ready for anything. Hey, talk about global warming. Sure. Let me give you a master class in every hurricane that's ever hit Florida in recorded history. And let me just emphasize something that you may not have picked up from just the audio. That was right off the top of his head. There was no notes. There was no teleprompter. Kamala would never, ever. Coming up, Brian Cavanaugh, former FEMA official, talks to us about how do we recover from a storm and how do we make FEMA work for America again. Hey, good afternoon to you. It's 3:35 News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up next hour, Real Clear Politics White House reporter Philip Wegman joins us at 4:30. And then at 5 o'clock, from Do No Harm, the group that's looking out for kids across the country, trying to stop this twisted ideology of genital mutilation that the left has been advancing. Beth Serio will join us. And you can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Well, while Kamala Harris has been politicizing our storms, Americans have been struggling to pick up the pieces on their own. The experience recently in especially western North Carolina with Hurricane Helene has not been a good one when it comes to government response. The federal government failing so many people. Why is this happening? The White House says that if you criticize the federal response, that you're guilty of mis- and disinformation, and they'd like to see you censored. For more on this subject, I want to bring in Brian Cavanaugh now. He's a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former FEMA official. Sir, good to have you back with us.
Hey, Ben, it's great to be on the show. I appreciate you allowing me to join the audience today.
Thank you very much. There's a lot has been said about FEMA and its response to storms. And I have to admit, I'm very concerned, Brian, because I one of the primary things I look at is I look at their website. I go to their website and I see things like FEMA is spending untold sums of cash that they proudly brag about on foreign nationals, for instance, or that FEMA is prioritizing equity as its number one goal. And I'm thinking to myself that, man, they really have their eye off the ball. What do you think, Brian?
I really think you nailed it. I think probably more so than anybody else has in the last several days, that this is fundamentally a flaw of FEMA departing from its mission. You look at the things they've done over the last 3.5 years. They prioritize DEI. They prioritize climate initiatives. Instead of hiring emergency response officials, they're hiring hundreds of DEI and climate advisors, creating climate and DEI task forces across the agency. To me, I just don't understand how that's improving your ability to respond to disasters and making you deliver on the mission to serve and assist Americans before, during, and after a disaster.
So, in other words, something like that has to come with costs. It's not cost free. You can't just add a bunch of frivolous new programs and have no impact on the stuff you're supposed to be doing, your core mission.
Absolutely. And so if you look, since COVID, FEMA's had a high rate of turnover with its personnel. So instead of replacing them with emergency response officials, what I've heard from people who continue to work at FEMA is there's just been this glut of advisors that they're hiring advisors under this weird job series code 0301 in the federal government, which is kind of a catch-all. And they were giving them these titles of DEI advisors, climate advisors. And that's something I was hearing about just this past week, was that they've stood up these climate and DEI advisory task forces. So, I mean, my concern is in 2018, we went on a really big campaign to, I was at the National Security Council at that time, but Brock Long was really trying hard over at FEMA to instill a culture of preparedness, teach Americans what it means to be prepared in light of disasters. And then the other focus was, how do we improve mission delivery to states? FEMA's real mission is to ensure the states have what they need to be able to deliver for their constituents, their citizens. And that's really fundamentally where we've departed over
Big
the last
time.
several years.
Well, I just want to drill in, though, because DEI is a euphemism for using racial prejudice as a means to decide who gets federal benefits. That's what they're talking about. It's FEMA's responsibility is to help people in a time of emergency. If you're bringing in so-called DEI experts, what you're trying to do is recalibrate FEMA to be an agency that delivers benefits on the basis of skin color. And, Brian, that is, as I understand it, illegal. The Civil Rights Act makes that exact thing, that exact arrangement, completely illegal. It prohibits discrimination for anyone who receives financial assistance on the basis of race, color, or national origin. What am I missing?
You're not missing anything. In fact, I scratched my head and wanted the same thing, especially when you listen to, there was a recent report that was done with a Congressional Research Service, I believe it was, about, FEMA delivering equity in its responses. And then I was trying to wrap my head around what that even meant. I've listened to FEMA talk publicly about how disasters impact communities disproportionately and differently based on various scorecards you want to keep: race, gender, ethnicity. To me, when I was there for the decade I worked at FEMA, we were about helping Americans. We were about making sure we educated Americans to close the gap on vulnerabilities they had with their resilience and their preparedness. I process over 360 presidential disaster declarations while I was on the National Security Council. And at no point in time did I ever review those with the lens of what race, sex, what gender. That was not a context of what you were evaluating the effectiveness of the disaster request.
Now, I naively thought that the job of FEMA was supposed to be to help the most possible people with the resources that FEMA has. Isn't that what the mission should be?
Absolutely. I think, it leads me to my next thing, which is, over the last 2 weeks, we've heard a lot of the boy who cried wolf when it comes to FEMA resources and FEMA readiness. You go back to a week and a half ago, FEMA's broke. They don't have any money for the next disaster. I think Karine Jean-Pierre said Congress needs to get back from their recess and appropriate funds to FEMA. And I'm sitting there staring at the Disaster Relief Fund report that's available online. And I'm like, okay, you have $647 million in the Disaster Relief Fund's base, which is their account for immediate emergency response to these types of events. And I'm trying to understand where you spend $647 million in this immediate response. It's my understanding they spent around $30 million within a week of Helene. Well, $30 million still keeps you above $600 million.
Yeah.
So I felt like it was a false flag to say they needed Congress to come back and appropriate money.
Well, it was sort of the typical
move.
Yeah, it's a very cynical and unfortunate Washington move. The Biden administration specializes in it, which is when people are suffering, exploit that in order to get more money, which is just an awful impulse. because the primary goal should actually be rescuing those people. We still have no idea how many people are actually dead and also missing from Hurricane Helene. I realize the media is moving on from this, but that's a real tragedy. The second highest death toll of a hurricane since Hurricane Katrina, and that's the kind of partisan political behavior we were getting out of the Biden-Harris administration.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a bit of a deliberate move on some people in the administration's on their end, is they know that the news network cycle is going to pass at a given point in time. So all they have to do is kind of bluster until it's moved on to the next issue, which is really sad for the people of Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, and parts of Georgia that are like the most severely impacted by what just happened.
What do you make of the FEMA response in North Carolina to the extent that we can measure it? We heard a lot of reports early on that it was basically civilians who were undertaking their own rescue missions for days, that there was a lot of government impediments imposed on the people trying to conduct those rescues or deliver goods. And then finally, the president came out and said, I'm mobilizing 1,000 active duty troops. And it even took a while for them, the soldiers from Fort Liberty, to get there. How do you score it, Brian?
I have to be honest and say that we probably need to do a better job of management expectation for the federal government when it comes to emergency response. You're looking at it through the lens of a hurricane. So parts of Florida received a pre-landfall emergency declaration, so which means FEMA can surge resources into that area before the storm even hits. What you had happen inland in North Carolina and other states is a no-notice event. It was not something that's predictable that you're going to see something of that scale, a flood hit Asheville, North Carolina. That's not something that was forecasted and predicted. So you don't do a pre-landfall declaration for those parts of the country.
Sure. So
they're going to get their disaster declaration. And then what I say on a no-notice event, the clock for the federal government is really somewhere in the ballpark of 48 to 72 hours when you start to see a robust federal response. It's not meant to upset anyone. I'm just giving you the reality of how it takes to move something as large as the federal government into position.
Yes.
Which is ironic because, and here's where I'm going to say something that kind of strikes me odd. The Cajun Navy, which has been so helpful and so impactful for so many American citizens over the last couple of decades in doing citizen-to-citizen assistance in the immediate hours after an event.
Yeah.
In President Trump's administration, he praised them for closing that gap that he recognized. It's hard to get the federal government to close that 0 to 72-hour gap. And he encouraged, to the extent practical, you encourage and thank them and acknowledge the service they're doing. What we saw in the early days of North Carolina was people being told to stop. And we don't want to see civilians helping civilians. It's not safe. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't go in there. And I just thought to myself, that's counterproductive to the culture that groups like the Cajun Navy have really adopted and embraced over the last.
And it's also it's fundamentally anti-American because the conception of this country at its founding is that it is, of the people, for the people, by the people. It's our country, and that the government is supposed to serve some of those broad things that we can't do on our own. But really, it's like, it's us. It's us. And so the government coming in there and acting like, oh, you stupid citizens, how dare you get up in your helicopters and attempt to conduct these rescues, or stopping Elon Musk's Starlink from being delivered, these terminals from being delivered to people who needed them because, oh, he doesn't have the actual name of the person he's delivering it to. Well, no kidding. He doesn't know how many people. These are strangers who are stranded, and they're trying to get in there and find people to establish connection with them. Government proved to be, in many awful ways, a real impediment to what people needed in this desperate time.
I would say absolutely a fact. And then the other thing is when you talk about, again, management expectation, they talked about $750. We're going to give survivors $750 for this immediate assistance that they need. I feel like that's a little bit of a false advertisement. You have to go apply for it. And odds are, if you're an insured citizen, you're likely not going to get approved for the full $750. You'll get some smaller percentage of that. We shouldn't be mismanaging expectations on the front end. And I think that was done very heavily.
Yeah.
And I think it also is indicative of I wrote a piece on this last week, failed visible leadership. We just didn't have visible leadership in the early onset of Helene. And if you look at like the days before Helene hit compared to yesterday, notice the subtle differences that the administration took to try and put visible leadership out there. I think that was a very widespread common critique was there's just no leadership.
Well, there's a huge difference between part of this is like the Biden administration seems to have anticipated, because we know what the history looks like, that Ron DeSantis is going to be the single most visible subject in the wake in the lead up in the wake of a hurricane like Milton. Because Ron DeSantis is very good at this. He knows the details and he's aggressively responding. And as a state's governor, he's ultimately in charge of that response. It's FEMA that's assisting him there. We didn't see the same thing in North Carolina. Roy Moore is not good at this. Roy Moore has barely been visible during all of this. And so I think a lot of that was really predicated on the way that the governors acted, don't you?
I would agree. I think there's something to be said for having a very visible, strong, and governor who's competent. And, that's something, Governor DeSantis has been doing this for several years. I've worked directly with Governor DeSantis when I was at the National Security Council. He and his team are absolute professionals in how they handle hurricane season. And as a side effect of that, they're really good at handling pretty much any crisis you throw at them. So I commend him for his ability to kind of take command and be visible. And you know what the other important thing is? He's also accountable. I think that's something that can't be stated enough about quality and leadership is accountability. And that has been something that Governor DeSantis has not shied away from.
No, not at all. No, he knows the details. He knows when things are not going well. He acknowledges them and then he fixes. That's not the way Biden and Harris handle stuff at all. Brian Cavanaugh from the Heritage Foundation, former FEMA official. Thank you very much for your insights today. Good to talk to you, sir. Let's go to the phones. I've got Dave calling in from McLean on line 4. Hello, Dave. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Hey, Vince. How you doing?
I'm good,
Sorry
sir.
about that.
Yeah.
The guy you had on was a great guest you had on there. One of the problems I think that the public doesn't understand is what happened in 2002 with the formation of the Homeland Security, and basically destroyed not only the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, and border protections, and homogenized the budget process.
Right.
So the money could flow back and forth between everybody, and then they could funnel it however they wanted to. And it hurt all those agencies.
Yeah. So consolidating all those agencies under DHS, you say was a real problem for each of them.
Well, I think it is. Because you lost the esprit de corps of the Secret Service, and also you allowed the bureaucrats to go, well, we can move a little bit of money here and there, no one will notice it until they run out of money. Mm-hmm. Then the Coast Guard, who was under the Department of the Navy during wartime, lost their ability to, take care of themselves. And it allowed the Bureau, like a black program with, stealth and military, the accountability becomes very muddled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, of course, we're looking at the way that they actually spend money, Dave, and normally they brag about it in press releases that nobody pays attention to. But then when a disaster strikes like this and we look back, we're like, wait a second, you spent all this money on illegals? And then what does the White House say? The White House comes out and they're like, this is misinformation. What do you mean it's misinformation? So you wrote it? It came out on your website. And so I'm supposed to interpret that as that I'm being misled? It doesn't make any sense. And it's garbage, Dave. And you sit there and you get insulted by it.
And it allows the people at the top, like what's his name, Alejandro Mayorkas, to basically sign the checks however he feels, that he wants to do it. And then your DEI, throw that in there too. It's cost a couple $100 million.
Yep.
Wasted money. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, and he sits there wondering why we impeached him. Why do we want to get rid of that guy? Well, there are billions of reasons. A lot of them money. Remember the border? Remember when we used to have one? Yeah, we got to get rid of Mayorkas. This whole crew. Speaking of Mayorkas, he pretended to answer questions to the press today. Among the questions, hey, how did an Afghan terrorist who wanted to attack us on Election Day get into the country? Can you clear that up for us? The DHS's secretary's miserable answers on this subject coming up.